In the suffocating darkness beneath Jerusalem's scorched stones, where the weight of 3,000 years presses down like the hand of an angry God, a secret waits. Not the secret the history books tell, not the noble tale of warrior monks protecting Christian pilgrims, but something far darker, far more dangerous. What if I told you that the Knights Templar didn't guard the roads to Jerusalem, they ransacked the holiest vault in human history? What if their legendary wealth didn't come from banking innovations, but from stolen treasures so powerful that Rome itself trembles at the whisper of their names? Picture this: 9 knights kneeling in the ruins of Solomon's temple, their faces lit by torchlight, swearing oaths that sound holy but mask intentions that are anything but. Above them, pilgrims pray. Below them, something ancient begins to wake. Because you see, what they found beneath those stones wasn't just gold or jewels. It was knowledge, objects, powers, things that predated Christ himself, that reached back to when Egyptian priests could part seas and call down fire from heaven. Things that could reshape reality itself. And the Vatican? They've spent 9 centuries making absolutely certain you never learn the truth. The year is 1119. Let that sink in. Feel it. Jerusalem burns under a sun that shows no mercy, its heat baking the blood-stained stones until they crack like old bones. The First Crusade has ended, leaving behind a city fractured between 3 faiths, each claiming divine ownership of ground that's seen more death than any earth should bear. But beneath the surface chaos, something else is happening. Something the chronicles don't record. Something the Vatican erased from every official history they could reach. 9 French knights, Hugues de Payens, Godfrey de Saint-Omer, André de Montbard, and 6 others whose names history barely remembers, arrive in Jerusalem with a stated mission: to protect Christian pilgrims on the dangerous roads to the Holy Land. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem grants them quarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built directly upon the ruins of Solomon's Temple. The official story says they spent the next 9 years guarding roads and praying, but that's a lie. A beautiful, perfectly constructed lie. You need to understand what they were really doing. While the rest of Jerusalem concerned itself with politics and prayer, these 9 men descended. Day after day, using tools smuggled in at night, they excavated the chambers beneath the temple. Not the known chambers, the forgotten ones. The sealed vaults that had been deliberately buried when the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 A.D. The work was brutal. The stone was ancient, fitted with a precision that shouldn't have been possible with Bronze Age tools. The air grew thicker the deeper they went, heavy with something that wasn't just dust. Some of the knights reported visions of robed figures speaking languages that hadn't been heard in millennia, pointing toward deeper darkness, gesturing to secrets that made their crosses feel suddenly hollow and insufficient. Brother Godfrey kept a journal. It was destroyed by the Inquisition in 1243, but fragments survived, copied by a monk who would later be burned as a heretic. His words are chilling. We have broken the 7th seal. The air tastes of copper and myrrh. The torches burn blue. Brother André saw faces in the stone not carved, but moving, as if the rock itself remembered what it had witnessed. We should turn back, but we cannot. Something calls us forward. Not God, something older. What they found in those depths changed them. Changed everything. The first chamber they breached, contained scrolls, hundreds of them, preserved in clay jars sealed with wax, marked with symbols that predated Hebrew script. These weren't Torah scrolls or Christian Gospels. They were older, much older, written in languages that blended Egyptian hieroglyphs with something else, something that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at it. Brother Hugues could read Latin, Greek, and rudimentary Hebrew, but these texts required something more. When he touched them, information seemed to download directly into his mind, not words, but understanding. Knowledge that bypassed language entirely and settled into his consciousness like inherited memory. The scrolls spoke of the temple's true purpose. Solomon, they revealed, hadn't built it simply to house the Ark of the Covenant. He had constructed it as a repository, a vault, a prison for objects of power that predated the Israelites by thousands of years, because Solomon, for all his biblical wisdom, had learned his magic from someone else. The texts named her Bacchus, the Queen of Sheba, but she was more than a queen. She was a keeper of Egyptian mystery traditions that stretched back to before the pyramids, to a time when magic wasn't mythology but technology, when objects could be crafted that bent reality to human will. The second chamber made the first seem like a warm dash-up dot. It was circular, carved from a single piece of limestone that showed no tool marks, no seams, no evidence of human construction. The walls were covered in gold leaf etched with hieroglyphs. That seemed to pulse with faint light impossible, since they were hundreds of feet underground with no source of illumination except the night's torches. At the center of the chamber stood a table of black basalt, and on that table, arranged with mathematical precision, lay objects that shouldn't exist. A scarab carved from lapis lazuli that was warm to the touch, that seemed to vibrate at a frequency just below audible range. Brother Andre picked it up, and for 3 days afterward, he could understand every language spoken in Jerusalem's markets: Arabic, Greek, Armenian, even the old Coptic dialects. On the 4th day, the ability faded, leaving him weeping with the loss of something he hadn't known he was missing. An ankh of solid gold, its proportions perfect, but scaled smaller than any temple version, small enough to wear concealed beneath robes. Brother Payan touched it once and collapsed, convulsing, speaking in a voice that wasn't his own ancient. Egyptian by the sound of it, though no one present could confirm. When he recovered, he claimed he'd witnessed his own death, seen his body old and broken, but also felt absolutely certain that death was not an ending, but a transition he no longer feared. A clay tablet covered in cuneiform that predated any known civilization. The text described methods for preserving consciousness beyond physical death, for transferring memory and identity into prepared vessels. Necromancy, the church would call it, but the tablet described it as technology, no more mystical than a water clock or an abacus. Most disturbing of all was what Brother Montbard found concealed in a hollow behind the basalt table, a mask of hammered electrum, a gold-silver alloy that the ancient Egyptians had prized above pure gold shaped to fit a human face. Its features were neither male nor female, neither young nor old, and inside the mask, along its inner surface, were etched thousands of tiny hieroglyphs, so small they could barely be seen, let alone read. Montbard made the mistake of placing the mask against his face. The others found him 3 hours later, still standing in the same position, the mask sealed to his skin as if it had grown there. His eyes were open but unseeing, and his breath came in shallow gasps. When they finally managed to remove the mask, and the removal left burns on his face that never fully healed, Montbard was different. He could see things, know things, walk into a room and immediately identify every person's deepest fear, their hidden shame, their secret desires. He could look at a document and know instantly if it was authentic or forged. He could predict with unnerving accuracy how people would react to specific situations, could manipulate outcomes by saying exactly the right words at precisely the right moment. In other words, the mask had given him powers that would make him invaluable to any organization seeking to accumulate influence and wealth. The Knights spent the next 6 years excavating 3 more chambers, each revealing objects that challenged everything they thought they knew about history, about magic, about the nature of reality itself. They found a bronze mirror that showed not your reflection, but possibilities, alternate versions of yourself, making different choices, living different lives. Staring into it too long drove Brother Payan to attempt suicide, unable to bear the weight of all the lives he wasn't living. A set of golden needles that, when properly inserted into specific points on the body, could enhance physical abilities beyond normal human capacity. Strength, speed, healing. The texts accompanying them described techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered until traditional Chinese medicine emerged centuries later, and even then, only partially. A collection of gemstones, each carved with a different symbol that seemed to store and release energy. Not metaphorically, actually, place them in sunlight, and they would glow for hours afterward in complete darkness. Arrange them in specific geometric patterns, and the air above them would shimmer and distort. And beneath it all, in the deepest chamber they dared to open, they found documentation. Not just scrolls, but a systematic archive. Names, bloodlines, genealogies that traced certain families from ancient Egypt through the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, through the Babylonian captivity, through the Roman occupation, all the way to medieval Europe. Their own names appeared in that archive. The 9 Knights hadn't been randomly selected for this mission. They had been guided here, called, by something or someone who had been waiting for them for over 1,000 years. The implications were staggering. Everything they'd been taught about divine providence and holy crusade suddenly seemed naive. They weren't the heroes of a sacred story. They were pawns in a game that stretched back to Egypt's old kingdom, pieces being moved by players who had understood the true nature of power long before Christ was born. The question that haunted their nights as they worked in those buried chambers was simple and terrifying. If they had been called here, guided to these objects of power, who had done the calling? And more importantly, what did those ancient players want in return? The desert wind above carried the call to evening prayer. But below, in chambers that predated Islam, Christianity, and even Judaism, the Knights Templar had found something that would make them the most powerful and most hunted men in medieval Europe. Their transformation had begun, and there would be no turning back. The objects weren't enough. That's what Brother Hugas de Payens realized on the night he nearly died. He'd been alone in the 4th chamber, the one they'd opened just 3 days prior, studying a collection of papyrus scrolls that seemed to resist every attempt at translation. The hieroglyphs were standard Middle Kingdom script. He'd learned enough to recognize that, much but arranged in patterns that violated every grammatical rule he'd managed to piece together from other texts. Then the torch went out, not flickered, not dimmed, extinguished, as if something had reached out and pinched the flame between invisible fingers. And in the absolute darkness 300 feet beneath Jerusalem, Hugus felt something move. Not air, not stone settling, something else. A presence that made his skin crawl and his bladder weaken. Something that had been waiting in that darkness for thousands of years, and his presence had finally woken it. When the other knights found him 2 hours later, drawn by his screams that somehow carried through solid rock, he was unconscious, clutching a scroll so tightly it had left impressions in his palms. His hair, which had been dark brown that morning, had gone completely white. More significantly, when he woke, he could read the scrolls. All of them, fluently, not because he'd learned ancient Egyptian overnight, but because something had been transferred, downloaded, imprinted onto his consciousness during those 2 hours in the dark. The knowledge hadn't come from study or divine inspiration. It had been forced into his mind by whatever had been sleeping in that chamber, and it wanted them to understand what they had found. What Hugus learned in those scrolls made the objects themselves seem almost mundane by comparison. The treasures they'd discovered weren't random artifacts scattered throughout the chambers. They were a library, a systematic collection of what the ancient Egyptians had called Hika, the technology of manipulating natural forces through properly constructed objects and rituals. Not magic, science, just science so advanced that it appeared supernatural to those who didn't understand the principles. The scarab that granted linguistic ability, it wasn't divine gift. It was a neural interface device that temporarily rewired the language centers of the brain, allowing instant access to linguistic patterns stored in the collective unconscious, what the Egyptians had called the Duat, the realm between life and death where all human experience was recorded and preserved. The ankh that showed visions of death, a quantum observation device that allowed consciousness to project forward along its own timeline, experiencing future states as present reality. The Egyptians had used such objects to prepare for death, to scout the territory ahead, to lose their fear of the inevitable transition. The mask that had burned Montbard's face and gifted him with terrible insight, a consciousness amplifier that enhanced the brain's natural ability to read micro-expressions, vocal patterns, and pheromone signals, essentially turning the wearer into a walking lie detector and psychological profiler. Every object had a purpose. Every artifact was a tool, and the scrolls contained the instruction manuals. But the most important scroll the one Hugus had been clutching when they found him detailed something that made his blood run cold, even as his mind raced with possibility. It described the location of other collections, other vaults, hidden across the ancient world by Egyptian priests who had foreseen the collapse of their civilization and taken steps to preserve their knowledge for future generations. One collection lay beneath Alexandria, in chambers that had been sealed before the library burned. Another was hidden in the caves of Qumran, where centuries later The Dead Sea Scrolls would be discovered, but those biblical texts were just a cover story, concealing deeper chambers that held objects of true power. A third collection had been transported to Ethiopia, protected by a lineage of priests who still guarded it, who still knew the old ways, who would recognize the proper signs and symbols, and grant access to those who carried the right bloodline markers. And a fourth this was the one that made Hugis's hands shake as he read had been taken to Rome itself, hidden beneath what would later become the Vatican, placed there deliberately by Egyptian priests who had converted to Christianity in its earliest days, who had embedded themselves in the new religion specifically to ensure that the old knowledge wouldn't be lost. The scroll was explicit. The treasures weren't meant to remain buried forever. They were meant to be found, studied, used, but only by those who understood the responsibility that came with such power, only by those who could resist the temptation to use Hika for personal gain or temporal conquest. The Egyptian priests who had hidden these collections had been specific about the qualifications. The finder must be spiritually disciplined, hence the test of kneeling before the objects without claiming them immediately, intellectually capable, able to read and understand the texts, morally sound, resistant to corruption by power, and most importantly, bloodline marked. This last requirement was the most disturbing. The scrolls described in detail how certain families carried genetic markers, actual physical traits encoded in their blood that made them more compatible with Heka technology. These bloodlines had been deliberately cultivated by Egyptian priests over generations, bred specifically to produce individuals who could safely use objects of power without being destroyed by them. The 9 knights checked their genealogies against the bloodline records found in the deepest chamber. Every single one of them matched. Their presence in Jerusalem wasn't coincidence or divine providence. It was genetics. They were the descendants of families that Egyptian priests had scattered across Europe over 1,000 years earlier, waiting for the right moment, the right combination of circumstances, to draw them back to the ancient knowledge. Brother Andre made the logical connection first. We're not the first, are we? This has happened before. Other groups, other eras finding these objects, using them, building power. Hubis nodded slowly, his new white hair catching the torchlight. The scroll lists 7 previous resurgences. Each time, bloodline carriers found the caches, accessed the power, built organizations that shaped their ages. And each time, he paused, his face grim, each time they were destroyed, hunted down and eliminated by another group, another organization that didn't want this knowledge to spread. The implications hit them all at once. They weren't the heroes of this story. They were the latest targets. Some organization that had survived through multiple eras, that had successfully suppressed 6 previous resurgences, was already watching them, already planning their destruction. The Vatican, Brother Montbard said quietly, his burned face twisting with bitter understanding. That's why the collection was hidden there, not for protection, as bait, to draw out anyone who came looking for a Heka knowledge. Rome knows. The Church knows. They've always known. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Everything they'd believed about their mission, about their faith, about the supposed holiness of their crusade, crumbled like ancient parchment. But then Brother Payan spoke, his voice carrying the weight of the death vision the Ankh had shown him. So we have a choice. We can return these objects, seal the chambers, pretend we found nothing, go back to being simple knights, or we become what we were bred to be, Hugas finished. We use the knowledge. We build something that can survive what's coming. We become powerful enough that when Rome comes for us, and they will come, we're ready. The vote was unanimous. They would take the treasures. They would study the texts. They would learn to use Heka, to wield the technology of the ancient world. And they would build an organization so wealthy, so influential, so militarily powerful that even the Vatican would have to negotiate rather than simply destroy. They would become the Knights Templar. Not the religious order that history would record, but something far more dangerous. A secret society that understood the true nature of reality, that possessed technology disguised as holy relics, that could manipulate events on a scale that would seem miraculous to ordinary observers. But first, they needed to learn, and learning would require sacrifices. Brother Payan volunteered to wear the mask again, to endure the burning and the terrible knowledge it would grant, because they needed someone who could read intentions, who could navigate the political waters they were about to enter. Brother Andre took the scarab, accepting that his mind would never be quite his own again, that he would always hear the whisper of dead languages in quiet moments, because they needed someone who could communicate with everyone from Egyptian merchants to Arab scholars. Brother Montbard claimed the bronze mirror, despite knowing it would show him possibilities he could never achieve, lives he would never live, because they needed someone who could anticipate consequences, who could see the branching paths of future decisions. And Hugas kept the scrolls, accepted the white hair and the nightmares as the price of knowledge, because someone had to be the keeper of the instruction manuals, the one who understood how all the pieces fit together. The remaining knights divided the other objects among themselves, each accepting whatever price came with their chosen artifact. They understood with a clarity that came from touching things that predated Christ, that power always demanded payment. The Egyptians had known this. The objects themselves enforced this truth, but they also understood something that their enemies didn't. The Vatican, for all its temporal power, was operating on faith and fear. The Templars would be operating on knowledge and technology. It wouldn't be a fair fight, as they began the long process of moving the most valuable objects to the surface, of creating convincing replicas to leave behind, of developing cover stories that would explain their sudden transformation from simple knights to wealthy power brokers. Hugas de Payens made a decision that would echo through the next 9 centuries. He decided they needed more than 9 members. They needed an entire order, an army of knights, yes, but also scholars, merchants, craftsmen, anyone who could help them understand and utilize the ancient knowledge they'd discovered. And they needed one more thing. They needed to find the other caches, particularly the one in Rome. If the Vatican was sitting on a collection of Egyptian power objects, if the church hierarchy had been using Heka technology all along, while condemning others as heretics for doing the same, then the Templars needed to know exactly what they were up against. The Second Crusade was still decades away. They had time to build, time to learn, time to prepare for the confrontation that was coming. because Brother Montbard's mirror had shown him the future. Multiple futures, actually. In some, the Templars rose to become the dominant power in Europe, their knowledge transforming civilization, ushering in an era of advancement that wouldn't naturally occur for centuries. In others, they burned. Every last one of them, accused of heresy, their treasures confiscated by kings and popes who divided the spoils while pretending to be horrified by Templar practices. The difference between those futures came down to a single factor: whether they could find and secure enough Hika objects before Rome realized what they had become. The race had begun, and the prize was nothing less than the future of human civilization itself. The expansion began with a lie so perfect that even those who told it started to believe. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem granted the Knights Templar their headquarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, not because he was pious, but because he was desperate. The kingdom needed military muscle, needed an organization that could protect pilgrimage routes and defend Christian holdings. What he didn't know, what he could never be allowed to know, was that the 9 knights kneeling before him had already transcended the need for his permission. Brother Hugh Estepayan stood before the king, with his prematurely white hair, and spoke words that had been carefully calculated using the bronze mirror's probability projections. Every phrase had been tested against multiple futures, refined until the outcome was nearly certain. The king would grant them autonomy. The king would give them legal protections. The king would, most importantly, ensure that the Pope himself endorsed their order. It worked flawlessly. Within a year, Pope Honorius II had officially recognized the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. The irony of that name, poor fellow soldiers, wasn't lost on the 9. They were already wealthier than most European nobles, their wealth hidden in forms that medieval accounting couldn't trace, because wealth, they had learned from the scrolls, was just crystallized energy, and they had objects that could manipulate energy itself. The scarab that Brother Andre wore concealed beneath his tunic didn't just grant linguistic ability. When properly activated, a process that required specific hand positions and whispered phrases in Old Kingdom Egyptian, it could influence the probability of financial transactions. Not blatantly, not obviously, just subtle shifts that ensured favorable outcomes. A merchant ship that should have sunk in a storm instead weathering it safely. A crop harvest that exceeded all projections. A gold mine producing twice its expected yield. Small miracles. Insignificant individually, but compounded over months and years, they built fortunes that seemed divinely blessed. The Templars understood something that their contemporaries didn't. Wealth wasn't about gold in vaults. It was about networks, connections, the ability to move value across distances and through time. And the Hika objects gave them advantages that made medieval banking seem like child's play. Brother Payan, wearing the consciousness-amplifying mask during critical negotiations, could read every micro-expression, every hesitation, every tell. He knew when someone was lying, when they were desperate, when they were about to betray a confidence. This made him the perfect banker. Clients trusted him with secrets they wouldn't share with priests or wives, never understanding that his insight wasn't divine inspiration, but Egyptian neurotechnology. Within 5 years, the Templars had established commanderies across Europe and the Holy Land. Within 10, They had invented the concept of international banking, though the scrolls made clear that Egyptian priests had done the same thing 3,000 years earlier, using sacred temple networks to move value across the Nile Delta. But the financial empire was just cover, camouflage for the real work. Brother Montbard had taken charge of what they privately called the collection. His task was to identify, locate, and secure every Heka artifact that could be found. The scroll from Jerusalem had provided starting points, but it was frustratingly incomplete. The Egyptian priests who had hidden the objects had been paranoid about creating detailed maps that could fall into the wrong hands. Instead, they had embedded clues in plain sight, in temple carvings, in papyrus texts that seemed to be nothing more than bureaucratic records or religious hymns, in the positioning of monuments that, when viewed from above, something impossible in ancient times but easily understood by minds trained in astronomical observation, created geometric patterns that pointed toward specific locations. The Templars acquired every Egyptian artifact they could find, not just Heka objects, but everything: statues, pottery, jewelry, mundane administrative tablets, because you never knew what might contain a hidden message, what might be the key to decoding a larger pattern. Their commanderies became museums of ancient knowledge, disguised as chapels and fortresses. In the basement of their Paris headquarters, they established what amounted to the world's first systematic archaeological research facility. Scholars worked alongside knights, translating texts, comparing artifacts, slowly piecing together the vast puzzle of Egyptian knowledge preservation. And they found things. They found things. In Alexandria, following clues embedded in a tax record that was 1,500 years old. They excavated a chamber that contained what the Egyptians had called a Ba bird, a human-headed bird statue made of solid gold. Standing 3 feet tall, its eyes crafted from gems that seemed to swirl with inner light. The Ba, according to Egyptian theology, was the part of the soul that could travel between worlds. And this statue? It wasn't symbolic. It was functional. A consciousness transfer device that allowed the user to project their awareness outside their body, to see through walls, to spy on distant locations as if physically present. Brother Geoffrey de St. Omer tested it once. Just once. He sat before the statue, following procedures detailed in an accompanying scroll, and his consciousness shot out of his body like an arrow from a bow. He found himself in Rome, standing in the papal apartments, watching as cardinals discussed the Templar question, whether the order was becoming too powerful, too independent, too wealthy, when his consciousness snapped back to his body 3 hours later. He was bleeding from the eyes and nose. It took him a week to recover fully, but the intelligence he'd gathered was invaluable. They now knew exactly what Rome suspected, what evidence the Vatican thought it had, and most importantly, what they were planning. The Vatican had its own collection. The scroll had been right. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica, in chambers that predated Christianity by centuries, the Church was sitting on Egyptian power objects that rivaled anything the Templars had found. But here was the crucial difference. Rome was afraid of the objects. They kept them locked away, forbidden, viewed as dangerous relics of pagan superstition that needed to be contained rather than studied. A few church officials who understood what they had were terrified by the implications. Convinced that using such objects would invite demonic possession or divine punishment, the Templars had no such qualms. They understood the objects were technology, morally neutral, capable of being used for good or ill, depending on the wielder's intent. This pragmatic approach gave them an enormous advantage. Brother Andre established contact with Egyptian Coptic communities that still maintained oral traditions from pharaonic times. These communities, hidden in remote desert monasteries, had been passing down knowledge for generations, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. From them, the Templars learned meditation techniques that enhanced the mind's ability to interface with Heka objects. They learned dietary practices that increased sensitivity to the subtle energies the artifacts manipulated. They learned bloodline histories that helped identify other Europeans who might carry the genetic markers necessary for safe object use. And they learned something else, something that changed everything. The Egyptian priests hadn't hidden their knowledge randomly. They had been preparing for a specific event, a convergence, a moment in time when certain astronomical alignments would occur, when the barriers between different states of reality would become permeable, when Heka technology would be exponentially more powerful than usual. That convergence was approaching. In the year 1307, less than 2 centuries away, specific planetary alignments combined with solar cycles would create conditions that hadn't existed since the fall of Egypt's new kingdom. During that window, which would last approximately 3 years, Heka objects would become so powerful that their use would be impossible to conceal. Everyone would see. Everyone would know that something impossible was happening. The Egyptian priests had hidden their collections to ensure that when that moment came, the knowledge would be ready, available, positioned to guide humanity through a transformation that would be either transcendent or apocalyptic, depending on who controlled the technology. The Templars now understood their true purpose. They weren't just protecting pilgrims or accumulating wealth. They were the designated inheritors of Egyptian Heka knowledge, chosen by genetic lineage and historical circumstance to be ready when the convergence came. But they also understood the danger. If the Vatican realized what was approaching, if Rome understood that the hidden objects would soon become impossible to conceal, the Church would move to destroy not just the Templars, but every scrap of Egyptian knowledge that remained. Better to burn everything than risk a technological revolution that would make religious authority obsolete. The race had accelerated. They had less than 2 centuries to accomplish several crucial tasks. First, secure every Heka object they could find. The more artifacts under Templar control, the less Rome could use against them. Second, decode the full operating instructions. The scrolls they'd found were comprehensive, but not complete. Key information was still missing, particularly regarding the most powerful objects, the ones that could reshape reality itself rather than just manipulating probability or enhancing consciousness. Third, breed the bloodlines. This was the most controversial decision, but genetic analysis of the genealogies made it necessary. They needed to concentrate the markers to create future generations who would be naturally compatible with Heka technology. Arranged marriages, strategic alliances, careful documentation of which families carried which traits. Fourth, establish redundancy. If Rome came for them, when Rome came for them, the knowledge had to survive. multiple copies of key texts hidden in different locations, objects distributed across their network rather than concentrated in vulnerable central locations, loyal members positioned throughout European power structures, ready to protect Templar interests even if the visible order collapsed. Brother Hugus spent his nights studying the bronze mirror, watching possible futures branch and diverge. Most paths led to the same destination: confrontation with Rome, accusations of heresy, destruction of the visible order. But in some futures the rare, narrow paths that required perfect timing and extraordinary luck, the Templars survived, transformed, went underground, but preserved both their knowledge and their power. Those were the paths they needed to navigate toward. Every decision, every action, every resource allocation was calculated to increase the probability of reaching one of those survival futures. The mirror showed him something else too, something that made his white hair seem appropriate. In the convergence of 1307, during those 3 years when Heka objects would reach maximum power, someone was going to open a gate, a doorway, not metaphorical but literal, a passage between the world of the living and what the Egyptians called the Duat, the realm of the dead, the dimension where consciousness persisted after physical death. If that gate opened improperly, if someone without proper training and safeguards tried to force it, the results would be catastrophic. The veil between worlds would tear rather than part cleanly. Things that should remain in the Duat would spill into the living world. The dead would walk, and not peacefully. The Egyptian priests had hidden their knowledge not just to preserve it, but to ensure that when the gate opened, and it would open, the convergence made that inevitable, it would be opened correctly, by those who understood the risks, by those who had the tools and training to control what came through. The Templars were running out of time. 2 centuries seemed long by human standards, but measured against the scope of what they needed to accomplish, against the magnitude of what was approaching, it was barely enough. They would need to work faster, recruit more aggressively, take greater risks, and they would need to accept that some of them wouldn't survive to see the convergence, that their role was to build the foundation, to position the pieces to ensure that when the crucial moment came, their descendants would be ready. Brother Hugus looked at his reflection in still water. The mirror itself was too dangerous to use for casual observation, and saw a man who had aged 30 years in less than a decade. The white hair, the lines around his eyes, the weight of futures that might never happen pressing down on his shoulders. But he also saw determination, purpose, the absolute certainty that came from touching objects that predated his god, that reached back to when magic was science and death was just another country to visit. They would succeed. They had to, because the alternative Rome controlling the convergence, the Church deciding who could pass through the gate and who couldn't, religious authority determining the future of human consciousness itself, was unthinkable. The network was expanding, the wealth accumulating, the knowledge growing, and beneath it all, hidden in the deepest vaults, the Heka objects waited, patient, powerful, ready for the moment when they would reshape the world. The Templars just had to survive long enough to see it happen. Cardinal Francesco Orsini had a gift, not the kind that priests spoke of in sermons, divine inspiration or prophetic vision. His gift was simpler, more practical, and infinitely more valuable to those who understood its true nature. He could smell lies, not metaphorically, actually smell them. A sharp, acrid scent like copper, mixed with rotting flowers, that filled his nostrils whenever someone spoke an untruth in his presence. He had possessed this ability since childhood, had learned to hide it from everyone except those few within the church hierarchy who needed to know what Francesco didn't know. What he could never be allowed to know was that his gift wasn't divine. It was genetic. He was a descendant of one of the bloodlines, carried markers that made him sensitive to the same subtle energies that Hika objects manipulated. The Vatican had been collecting such individuals for centuries, identifying them through careful observation, recruiting them into positions where their abilities could serve church interests. The Vatican had its own network, its own collection, its own understanding of what the Egyptian objects could do. And in 1289, Cardinal Orsini became the youngest member of the Council of Seven, the secret body within the Church. They managed what they called the containment. His first meeting took place in a chamber that officially didn't exist, accessed through a hidden door behind a false wall in the papal library. 6 older men sat around a table of black basalt Egyptian, 3rd dynasty, worth more than most kingdoms. The table itself was a Hika object, though its function was subtle. It prevented anyone seated at it from speaking direct lies. You could omit information, mislead through implication, remain silent. But you couldn't speak an untruth while touching its surface. Cardinal Benedetto, the eldest, spoke first. His voice carried the weight of 40 years managing the containment. You've been chosen for this council because your gift is needed. The situation with the Templars has escalated beyond what normal methods can address. We need someone who can distinguish truth from deception in ways that ordinary interrogation cannot achieve. Francesco listened as they detailed what the Church had known for over a century. The Knights Templar had found something in Jerusalem, something that had transformed them from simple warriors into the wealthiest, most influential organization in Christendom, something that gave them abilities that seemed miraculous but were actually technological. The Council of Seven had been tracking Templar activities for decades. They knew about the commanderies that functioned as research facilities. They knew about the Egyptian artifacts being collected under the guise of holy relics. They knew about the genetic breeding programs disguised as strategic marriage alliances. What they didn't know, what they desperately needed to discover, was the full extent of what the Templars had found. How many objects? How powerful? What were they planning? We need you to infiltrate their network, Cardinal Benedetto explained. Not as a spy, they would detect that immediately, but as a potential ally, someone who appears to carry the bloodline markers they're looking for, someone who seems to be seeking the same knowledge they possess. Francesco felt the weight of what was being asked. You want me to pretend to be one of them? Not pretend, become, learn their secrets from the inside. Use your gift to identify which Templars are key to their operation, which ones know the most, which ones are vulnerable to manipulation. Benedetto's eyes were hard. We're not asking you to betray your faith. We're asking you to save it, because what the Templars are doing threatens everything the Church has built. Over the next 3 years, Francesco transformed himself. He studied Egyptian history and language. He traveled to Cairo and Alexandria, making contact with the same Coptic communities that had taught the Templars. He allowed himself to be discovered by Templar recruiters, played the role of a disillusioned church official who had glimpsed forbidden knowledge and wanted to understand more. The performance was flawless. By 1292, he had been initiated into the outer circles of Templar knowledge. By 1295, he had access to some of their research facilities, and by 1298 he had seen enough to terrify him. The Templars weren't just collecting artifacts. They were systematically reverse engineering them, breaking down the objects into their component principles, understanding the underlying technology, and beginning to replicate it using medieval materials and methods in a workshop beneath their Paris commandery. Francesco watched a Templar craftsman create a new scarab from lapis lazuli and gold, following procedures documented in scrolls that predated Moses. The craftsman wore protective gear leather gloves, a mask of thick wool, because the creation process involved substances that burned flesh and created vapors that induced hallucinations. When the scarab was complete, they tested it on a volunteer, a young knight who had been studying Arabic for 3 years. Touched the artifact and suddenly spoke the language with native fluency. Not just the dialect he'd been learning, but every major variant from Morocco to Baghdad. The effect lasted 4 days before fading. They were manufacturing Hika objects, creating new artifacts based on ancient principles, and every success brought them closer to understanding the underlying science that made such objects possible. Francesco reported everything to the Council of Seven. He described the workshops, the texts being translated, the breeding programs tracking genetic markers through noble families. He detailed the financial network that now extended from Jerusalem to London, the intelligence gathering that gave Templars advance warning of political developments, the technology that made them seem blessed by powers beyond normal human capability. But he also discovered something the Council hadn't anticipated. He was starting to believe the Templars weren't the heretics the Church painted them as. They were scholars, scientists working with paradigms that medieval Europe had forgotten or never known. They saw the Hika objects not as demonic tools, but as human achievements, technologies developed by a civilization that had understood natural laws. The medieval world was only beginning to rediscover. More troubling still, Francesco had met Brother Montbard, the one who had been burned by the consciousness-amplifying mask. The scarring on his face was permanent, but so were his abilities. He could read Francesco like an open book, could sense the conflicted loyalties, the growing doubt about his mission. One night, in a secure chamber where no one else could overhear, Montbard confronted him directly. "You're Vatican intelligence. Council of Seven. They sent you to learn our secrets so they could destroy us more effectively." Francesco's hand moved toward the knife concealed in his robes, but Montbard made no threatening gesture. He simply smiled a sad, knowing expression that made him look ancient, despite being only 40 years old. "I'm not going to kill you, Francesco, or expose you. Do you know why?" Montbard touched his scarred face. "Because I've seen your possible futures. The mask showed me. And in the paths where you survive, where you make the choices that matter, you're not working for Rome. You're working for something larger, for humanity itself." The cardinal felt his gift activate. his nostrils searching for the scent of deception. Nothing. Montbard was telling the truth as he understood it. The Council of Seven thinks they're protecting the Church, Montbard continued. Protecting religious authority from technological knowledge that might make faith obsolete. But that's not what's really happening. The containment isn't about preserving Christianity. It's about preventing human evolution. He produced a scroll, weathered with age, covered in hieroglyphs. This text is 3,000 years old. It describes what the Egyptian priests called the awakening, a period when enough humans would possess activated bloodline markers that consciousness itself would shift. Individuals would be able to access genetic memories to learn from every generation that came before them. Death would become a transition rather than an ending. The barriers between minds would become permeable. Humanity would evolve beyond individual isolation into something collective, connected. Francesco stared at the scroll, his gift telling him that every word Montbard spoke was truth as the man believed it. The convergence of 1307 will trigger that awakening, Montbard said. The planetary alignments will make Hika technology so powerful that its use will be impossible to hide. Everyone will see. Everyone will understand that the world isn't what they've been told. And the Vatican is terrified of that moment because it will reveal that the Church has been sitting on this knowledge for centuries, keeping it from humanity while using it themselves. The Council has Heka objects? Francesco asked, though he already knew the answer. Beneath the papal palace there's a chamber that makes our collection look like trinkets. The ankh of eternal life that grants visions of death. Rome has 12 of them. The Ba bird that allows consciousness projection. They have 3, plus the instruction manuals we've been desperately searching for. The mask I wore that burned my face and opened my mind? They have the original, the first one ever created, so powerful that wearing it for more than a few minutes drives most users permanently insane. Montbard's burned face twisted with bitter irony. The Vatican has been using Egyptian magic to maintain power for over 1,000 years, while condemning anyone else who does the same as heretics. The containment isn't about protecting humanity from dangerous knowledge. It's about monopolizing that knowledge, ensuring that only the Church hierarchy has access to powers that should belong to all humans with the genetic capability to use them safely. Francesco felt his worldview cracking like ice over deep water. Everything he'd believed about his mission, about the Council's righteous purpose, about the Templars as threats to holy order, it was all built on foundations that were suddenly revealed as corrupt. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked quietly. "Because you're good at smelling lies, Francesco. And you've just realized that the biggest lie of all is the one you've been serving." Montbard stood, his movements carrying the weariness of someone who had seen too many futures. "You have a choice to make. You can report everything you've learned to the Council, help them plan our destruction, and ensure that human evolution is controlled by an institution that fears change above all else. Or you can help us prepare for the convergence. Help us ensure that when the awakening comes, it happens in a way that benefits all humanity, rather than just preserving Vatican authority." The scarred Templar moved toward the door, then paused. "The mirror has shown me your possible paths. In the futures where you choose the Council, you die within 5 years, killed by the very people you're trying to serve, because you'll know too much, represent too much risk. In the futures where you help us, where you become what you were genetically meant to be, rather than what the Vatican trained you to be, you survive to see the convergence. You witness the awakening, and you understand, finally, what humanity is truly capable of becoming. He left Francesco alone with the scroll, with the choice, with the weight of futures that hadn't happened yet, but felt inevitable. Cardinal Francesco Orsini sat in that chamber for 3 hours, his gift silent, because he was alone with his own thoughts, his own truth. He thought about the Council of Seven, about men who hoarded power while claiming to serve God. He thought about the Templars, flawed and human, but seeking knowledge rather than suppressing it. He thought about the convergence approaching, about a moment when humanity would either evolve or be forced back into ignorance by those too afraid to let go of control. By the time he emerged from that chamber, he had made his decision. The Vatican would receive his reports, yes, but they would be carefully edited, crucial information omitted, key capabilities understated. He would become a double agent, protecting the very organization he had been sent to infiltrate, because his gift for detecting lies had finally turned inward, had finally made him confront the deceptions he'd been living within. And the truth it revealed was simple and devastating. The church he served had become the enemy of human potential. The Templars, for all their flaws and ambitions, were fighting for humanity's right to understand its own nature, to access its full capabilities, to evolve beyond the limitations that fear and control had imposed. The convergence was coming. The awakening was inevitable. And Cardinal Francesco Orsini had just chosen which side he would serve when the world discovered that magic was real, that consciousness was immortal, and that the greatest conspiracy in human history was perpetrated not by secret societies seeking power, but by religious authorities claiming to protect souls while actually imprisoning minds. The Vatican's eyes had been turned inward, and what they saw there would change the course of the secret war that was about to explode into the open. The betrayal had begun, and this time it would be Rome that would bleed for its sins. The year was 1305, 2 years before the convergence, 2 years before the planetary alignments would make Heka. Objects glow with power so intense that even ordinary humans would see them pulse with otherworldly light. 2 years before everything the Templars had built would either ascend to unprecedented heights or collapse into ashes and forgotten legends. Brother Hugues de Payens was long dead, his white hair and haunted eyes buried in soil that had absorbed the dreams of too many men who had seen too much. But his legacy lived on in Grand Master Jacques de Molay, a man who wore the accumulated knowledge of 8 decades like armor that had grown too heavy but couldn't be removed. De Molay stood in the deepest vault beneath the Paris Temple, surrounded by objects that would make kings weep and popes pray, though whether those prayers would be for salvation or damnation was a question he no longer bothered to ask. The collection had grown beyond anything the original 9 knights could have imagined. 47 scarabs, each attuned to different linguistic families, arranged in geometric patterns on shelves of Lebanese cedar. 18 ankhs of varying sizes and power, some showing death as peaceful transition, others revealing it as doorway to realms that human consciousness wasn't meant to navigate. 7 masks, including the one that had burned Montbard's face a century ago. now handled only with special gloves made from the preserved skin of crocodiles' animals. The Egyptians had considered sacred for reasons that the texts made horrifyingly clear, and at the center of the vault, newly acquired at devastating cost, the object that changed everything, the jed pillar dot, it stood 8 feet tall, carved from a single piece of stone that geological analysis said shouldn't exist, mineral composition that had no natural source on Earth. That seemed to have been synthesized using techniques the modern world wouldn't rediscover for 7 centuries. The pillar was covered in hieroglyphs so densely packed that reading them required magnification, and at its apex, set into the stone with impossible precision, was a crystal that pulsed with faint blue light, even incomplete. The darkness dot, the scrolls were explicit about what this object could do. The jed pillar was a stabilizer, a control mechanism. When properly activated during the convergence, it would regulate the flow of energy through other Heka objects, prevent them from overloading, keep the power manageable rather than letting it spiral into catastrophic release. The Egyptian priests who had created had understood that the convergence wasn't just an opportunity, it was a danger. During those 3 years when the planetary alignments made the barriers between worlds permeable, when Heka technology reached its maximum potential, the risk of uncontrolled activation was enormous. Objects might trigger spontaneously. Gates might open without proper preparation. The dead might walk, not because anyone had summoned them, but because the barriers that kept them in the duat had temporarily dissolved. The jed pillar was insurance. Ancient Egyptian insurance, but insurance nonetheless. And the Templars had paid for it with the lives of 17 knights who had traveled into the Nubian desert, following leads from texts that were older than the pyramids, and had found a temple complex that predated Egyptian civilization itself. Only 3 of those 17 had returned, and what they brought back had cost them their sanity. 2 were still alive, kept in comfortable rooms in the Paris commandery, speaking occasionally in languages that mixed Egyptian with something older, something that hurt to hear, that made the air feel thick and wrong. The 3rd, the one who had actually touched the jed pillar and survived, had died screaming 3 days after returning to Paris, but before death took him, he had drawn diagrams, detailed, precise instructions for how to position the pillar, what other objects needed to be arranged around it, what words and what sequence would activate its stabilizing function. Demale had memorized those instructions. He had verified them against every text in the Templar archives, cross-referenced them with information from their spy network, even consulted with Francesco Cardinal Orsini technically, though the man no longer served Rome in anything but name. Francesco's intelligence from within the Vatican had confirmed their worst fears. The Council of 7 knew about the convergence. They had known for decades, had been preparing their own response, and their plan was simple, brutal, and potentially world-ending. They intended to destroy every Heka object outside Vatican control, burn every text, kill every individual who carried the activated bloodline markers. And then, during the convergence, when the power reached its peak, they would use the objects in their own collection to seal the gates permanently, not just prevent the awakening. Actually prevent it. Use the convergence's power to ensure that the barriers between consciousness and matter, between individual minds and collective awareness, between the living and the do-it would remain forever impermeable. Humanity would be locked into its current limited state for all time, unable to evolve, unable to access the genetic memories that previous generations had left encoded in their DNA. The Vatican's reasoning was theological. If humans could access the do-it, could see beyond death, could experience consciousness as something immortal and transferable, then Christianity's entire framework collapsed. Heaven and hell became meaningless. Salvation and damnation became obsolete. The Church's authority to determine who received eternal reward versus eternal punishment would evaporate like morning mist. Better, the Council of Seven had decided, to damn all of humanity to permanent ignorance than to risk losing religious control over human consciousness. De Malle turned from the Jed pillar to face the assembled leadership of the Templar order. 23 men, each carrying genetic markers, each having undergone partial awakening through controlled exposure to Heika objects, each understanding that the next 2 years would determine whether their organization survived to see the transformation they'd been preparing. For across 9 generations, Rome will move against us before the convergence, he said without preamble. The time for gentle diplomacy had passed. Francesco's latest intelligence confirms it. King Philip of France is drowning in debt our debt, ironically, and the Vatican has offered him a solution. Destroy the Templars, confiscate our assets, and receive both financial relief and papal blessing for the murder of hundreds of knights. Silence greeted this pronouncement. Not shocked silence, they had all known this was coming, but the heavy quiet of men accepting that the future they'd feared had finally arrived. They'll strike on Friday the 13th. De Malle continued. October 1307, 2 months before the convergence begins. They want us destroyed before the power peaks, before our objects become too strong to confiscate safely. Brother William of Tyre, current keeper of the Scarab collection, spoke up. Can we evacuate? Move the objects, scatter the knowledge, go underground until the danger passes? That's exactly what they expect us to do, De Malle replied. Francesco has seen the arrest warrants. They're not just targeting our commanderies. They've identified our backup locations, our safe houses, the families we've been breeding for bloodline concentration. This isn't a raid. It's an extinction event. You let that sink in before continuing, but they've made 2 mistakes. First, they don't know about Francesco. They think their intelligence network is secure, that we're blind to their planning. Second, they don't fully understand what the Jed pillar does. De Malle placed his hand on the ancient stone, feeling the faint vibration that ran through it like a slow heartbeat. The texts say this object stabilizes the convergence, prevents uncontrolled power release. That's true, but it doesn't just stabilize, it amplifies. Used correctly, the Jed pillar can take the energy of the convergence and channel it, direct it, make it do more than just dissolve barriers temporarily. It can reshape those barriers permanently. The implications hit them all at once. Brother Thomas of Acre, oldest of the assembled knights, voiced what everyone was thinking. You want to force the awakening. Not wait for the natural convergence, but use the Jed pillar to make it happen on our terms. Rome wants to seal the gates forever, De Malle said quietly. We're going to blow them open. Not during the convergence, when they expect it, when they're prepared to counter it. But before. 6 months early. While they're still positioning their pieces, still gathering their objects, still confident that they have time. Can it even be done? Brother William asked. The texts say the convergence is about planetary alignment, about cosmic forces that human intervention can't affect. The cosmic forces open a window, Damali explained. Make the barriers thin enough that Heika objects can push through them. But the Jed pillar doesn't need the barriers to be naturally thin. It can thin them artificially. Force open gates that should remain closed for another 6 months. The power expenditure will be enormous, will burn through most of our collection in the process, but it will work. He looked around the vault, at objects that represented centuries of searching, fighting, dying to assemble. We'll sacrifice 90% of what we've built. Destroy most of our Heka artifacts to power the Jed pillar. But the 10% we preserve, combined with the awakening we trigger, will be enough. Enough to ensure that when Philip's soldiers come for us, when Rome tries to complete their extinction plan, they'll find something they can't arrest or burn or bury. What will they find? Brother William asked, though the awe in his voice suggested he already knew. Awakened humans, Damali said simply. Not just us. Not just the bloodline carriers. But everyone. The activation will cascade through the entire human population. Genetic memories will unlock in people who never knew they carried them. Consciousness will expand beyond individual skulls. The barriers between living and dead will dissolve not temporarily, not for 3 years during a natural convergence, but permanently, forever. The silence that followed was absolute. What Damali was proposing wasn't just survival, it was transformation of the entire species. Forced evolution on a planetary scale. The Vatican has spent centuries preventing this awakening because they understand what it means, Damali continued. Religious authority becomes obsolete when every human can access divine consciousness directly. Political power becomes difficult to maintain when minds can connect and share information without language or borders. Control becomes impossible when death is revealed as a transition rather than an ending. They'll call it the apocalypse, Brother Thomas observed. It will be an apocalypse, Damali agreed. The ending of the old world, the birth of a new one. But apocalypse doesn't mean destruction, it means revelation. The unveiling of truth that's been hidden. And yes, that revelation will destroy certain power structures that depend on ignorance. But it will liberate humanity to become what we were always meant to be. Brother William raised the obvious problem, forcing an awakening 6 months early, using artificial power to thin barriers that should remain solid. The texts warn about this. They say premature activation can damage the gates, cause them to stick partially open, create permanent instability in the barriers between worlds. We could trigger something we can't control. We could, Damali acknowledged. But we know Rome's plan. We know they intend to seal the gates forever, to prevent human evolution indefinitely. Given a choice between risking instability and accepting permanent limitation, I choose risk. I choose the possibility of transcendence over the certainty of imprisonment. He pulled out a map, detailed and annotated, showing locations across Europe and the Holy Land. We have 2 years. In that time, we need to accomplish several things. First, move the Jed pillar to a location where it can't be confiscated before we're ready to use it. Second, Position our most valuable objects, the ones we're preserving rather than sacrificing, in locations where they'll survive both the activation and Rome's retaliation. Third, prepare our people for what's coming. Not just the knights, but the families we've been tracking, the bloodline carriers scattered across Europe who don't even know what they are. And fourth, Brother Thomas added quietly, we need to prepare for the possibility that we're wrong, that forcing the awakening will damage something that can't be repaired. We need contingencies, ways to reverse or at least limit what we're about to do if it goes catastrophically wrong. Damale nodded grimly. This was the burden that had given him nightmares for the past year, the responsibility of potentially damaging human consciousness itself in an attempt to liberate it. Francesco has identified 3 Vatican objects that could theoretically close gates we open prematurely. We'll need to steal them, keep them as insurance, and we'll need at least one person who remains unawakened, who can operate independently if the rest of us become lost in collective consciousness that we can't escape from. A watcher, Brother William said. Someone to guard the guards, exactly. Damale pointed to a name on his list. Young peer of Chartres. 17 years old, brilliant mind, carries the genetic markers but hasn't been exposed to any Hika objects yet. We'll train him in everything we know, but keep him isolated from the objects themselves. If the awakening goes wrong, if we need someone with a clear, individual consciousness to fix what we've broken, it will be him. The assembled Templars absorbed this information, each man calculating his own role in the impossible task ahead. They were going to challenge the Vatican, defy a king, and attempt to forcibly evolve the entire human species. The odds of success were minimal. The consequences of failure were extinction, but the alternative was worse. The alternative was allowing humanity to remain forever limited, forever ignorant, forever controlled by institutions that feared human potential more than they feared human suffering. Damale placed both hands on the Jed pillar, feeling the ancient stone's pulse synchronize with his own heartbeat. Somewhere in the do-it, he imagined, the Egyptian priests who had created this object were watching, waiting, hoping that their genetic descendants would have the courage to complete what they had started 3,000 years ago. The awakening was coming, not when the cosmos decreed it, but when humanity needed it, and nothing, not kings, not popes, not the weight of centuries of enforced ignorance, would stop it from happening. The next 2 years would determine the future of human consciousness itself. The Templars had made their choice. Now they just had to survive long enough to see it through. The letter arrived at dawn, carried by a rider whose horse had died beneath him, just outside the gates of the Paris temple. Brother Felipe de Marigny took the sealed parchment with hands that had learned to recognize the weight of doom in paper and wax dot. It was from Francesco, from Cardinal Orsini, from their man inside the Vatican who had been feeding them intelligence for 13 years. And it contained 3 words that made Felipe's blood turn to ice water. They know everything. By the time Grand Master Damale reached the vault, Felipe had already begun the evacuation protocols. 20 knights worked in controlled frenzy, wrapping Hika objects in consecrated linen, packing them into chests that had been prepared for exactly this moment. The Jed pillar, too large to move quickly, stood at the center of the chaos, like a lighthouse in a storm. Malay's face was carved granite as he read Francesco's full message. The Cardinal's intelligence was devastatingly precise. The Council of Seven had discovered Francesco's betrayal, not through investigation or espionage, but through one of their own Heka objects, a mirror that didn't show reflections, but revealed loyalties. Francesco had looked into it during a routine meeting, and the mirror had shown him standing with Templars rather than with Rome. The torture had lasted 3 days. The Vatican's interrogators were skilled, knew exactly how much pain a human body could endure before consciousness fled. Francesco had given them everything: the planned early awakening, the jade pillar's true function, the locations of Templar safe houses and backup archives, the names of bloodline families being cultivated for genetic enhancement, everything, and then, in an act of defiance that must have cost him whatever remained of his sanity, Francesco had managed to get one final message out before they killed him. A warning. 3 words that might give the Templars enough time to salvage something from the catastrophe, but probably not enough. "How long do we have?" Brother William asked, his hands never stopping their work wrapping a scarab in linen. "The message is dated 4 days ago," Damale replied, his voice hollow. Francesco was in Rome. Even with fast horses, Vatican forces couldn't reach Paris in less than 3 weeks. But King Philip's soldiers are already in France. If Rome sent word to Philip the moment they broke Francesco, he calculated quickly, then we have perhaps 5 days, maybe less. "The jade pillar," Brother Thomas said, stating the obvious problem that everyone was avoiding. "It can't be moved quickly, even disassembled. Even with our best wagon and a full team of horses, it would take a week to reach the Belgian safe house. They'll find it. They'll take it." Damale stared at the ancient stone pillar, at the crystal pulsing with faint blue light at its apex. This object represented 9 decades of searching, represented knights who had died in the Nubian desert to recover it, represented the only tool they had that could forcibly trigger the awakening ahead of schedule. Without it, they were just another medieval military order waiting to be crushed by the combined might of church and crown. With it, they could still change everything. "We activate it now," Damale said quietly. The frenzied packing stopped. Every knight in the vault turned to stare at their Grand Master. "Now?" Brother Philippa's voice cracked. "Master, we're not ready. The positioning calculations aren't complete. We haven't gathered all the power objects we need for the activation sequence. Pierre of Chartres isn't trained yet. We were going to spend another year preparing him to be the Watcher. If we do this now without proper preparation, Rome gets exactly what they fear most," Damale interrupted. "An uncontrolled awakening, premature, chaotic, impossible to predict or manage. The very thing their entire containment strategy has been designed to prevent." He moved to the pillar, placed both hands on its surface, felt the vibration that had been growing stronger over the past months as the natural convergence approached. "The cosmic alignment isn't optimal yet. We'll have to compensate with raw power, burn through more objects than we planned. And yes, the activation will be unstable. The gates we open might not close cleanly, but instability cuts both ways. If we can't control what we're about to unleash, neither can they." Brother Thomas understood first. "You're turning our forced awakening into a weapon, making it so unpredictable. so chaotic that Rome's own objects become liabilities, rather than tools of control. Exactly. Male's voice carried the weight of a man who had just condemned himself and everyone he commanded to an uncertain fate that might be worse than death. The Vatican's strategy depends on order, on knowing how the convergence will unfold, on being able to position their resources to counter specific threats. We're going to rob them of that advantage. Create a situation so volatile that their superior numbers and resources don't matter, because nobody, us or them, will know what's actually happening. The logic was brutal but sound. If they were going to be destroyed anyway, if Rome had intelligence that made survival impossible through conventional means, then their only option was to make the game board explode. Do something so radical that it reset all the calculations. Put everyone back to zero. We need 72 hours to prepare the activation sequence properly, Brother William said, his mind already working through the logistics. 48 at absolute minimum. Can we hold this position for 2 days against Philip's soldiers? We won't be here, Demale replied. Paris is compromised. Francesco gave them this location, but he didn't know about the backup chamber. Understanding rippled through the assembled knights. The backup chamber, the contingency location that even most Templars didn't know existed. Beneath the Cathedral of Chartres, hidden in foundations that predated Christianity, was a second vault. Smaller than the Paris facility, less well-equipped, but positioned directly above a geological anomaly that the ancient texts called a power vein, a natural concentration of the same energies that Hika objects manipulated. The Jed pillar could be activated there with less external power, less preparation, less precision in positioning. It would make the already risky awakening even more unstable, but it would also make it possible to attempt with only 48 hours of preparation instead of the 72 they needed in Paris. Start moving the objects to Chartres, the Male commanded. Everything we can transport in 6 hours. The rest we destroy. I won't let Rome capture a single artifact if we can help it. Brother Thomas, take 20 men and begin moving the Jed pillar. Use the underground passages. Travel only at night. Sacrifice speed for secrecy. You have 2 days to get it to Chartres. And if we're intercepted? Thomas asked. Then you trigger the pillar immediately. Wherever you are, even if it means activating in the middle of a road with Philip's soldiers watching. Better a chaotic, premature awakening than letting them capture the pillar intact. Demale turned to Brother Felipe. Send riders to every commandery we still control. Tell them Rome knows about the early activation plan. Tell them to initiate their own local awakenings using whatever objects they have available. We can't coordinate a single controlled event anymore, but we can create 100 small awakenings scattered across Europe. Individually weak, collectively overwhelming. Rome can't suppress them all. It was a desperate plan, improvised in minutes to counter a catastrophe that had been years in the making. But it had one crucial advantage. It was exactly the kind of reckless, suicidal gambit that the Vatican would never anticipate because it violated every principle of careful planning that had characterized Templar operations for 9 decades. The Templars had always been methodical, patient, willing to work across generations to achieve their goals. Rome had prepared countermeasures against that approach. They hadn't prepared for the Templars to simply throw all their pieces at the board simultaneously and see what survived the collision. Over the next 6 hours, the parish vault was systematically emptied. Objects that couldn't be transported were destroyed, not damaged, but ritually deactivated using procedures from the ancient texts, ensuring that their power dissipated rather than falling into enemy hands. The scarabs were crushed to powder. The ankhs were melted down. The masks were buried in separate locations, with curses inscribed around them that would make excavation hazardous for anyone without proper bloodline markers. Only the most critical items were saved. The text describing activation procedures, the genealogical records identifying bloodline families, a handful of objects small enough to carry and powerful enough to matter. Everything else was sacrificed to deny Rome a complete victory. By midday, the vault was empty. Brother Thomas and his team had departed with the Jed pillar, moving through tunnels that connected to the Paris catacombs, traveling routes that predated the medieval city. Demale stood alone in the hollow chamber, remembering the night 9 decades ago when the first artifacts had been brought here from Jerusalem, when everything had seemed possible and the dangers had seemed manageable. A footstep echoed from the entrance tunnel. Demale's hand moved to his sword, then relaxed as he recognized a figure emerging from darkness. Peer of Chartres, 17 years old, eyes too old for his face, carrying genetic markers that proclaimed him as bloodline, despite never having touched a Heka object. The designated watcher, the one who would remain unawakened, who would retain individual consciousness while everyone around him transformed into something posthuman. They told me to stay away from the vault, Peer said quietly. Said it was too dangerous, that I needed to remain pure for my role. But I figured if we're about to force an awakening that might destroy human consciousness, I should probably understand what I'm supposed to be watching. Demale studied the bueno. Not a boy, not anymore, not with those eyes that had seen too much fear and understood too much truth. What do you know about what we're attempting? Everything, Peer replied. I broke into the restricted archives 6 months ago. Read the text you thought I wasn't ready for. I know what the Jed pillar does. I know what happens when you force open gates that should remain closed. I know that the Egyptian priests who created these objects included warnings that you're ignoring because you're desperate. And yet you came here anyway, knowing what we're about to do. Peer moved deeper into the empty vault, his footsteps echoing off stone that had absorbed centuries of secrets. The warnings say premature activation might damage the gates permanently, might create instability in the barriers between consciousness and matter, might allow things from the do-it to cross into the living world without invitation or control. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. But they also say that damaged gates are still better than sealed ones. That instability is preferable to eternal limitation. That even a flawed awakening is superior to permanent ignorance. You agree with what we're doing? I think you're terrified old men making catastrophic decisions under pressure, Peer said bluntly. I think you're gambling with human consciousness itself because you're out of options and can't accept defeat. I think the chances of this working as intended are minimal, and the chances of something going horribly wrong are significant. He met Demale's eyes directly. But I also think you're right, that Rome's plan to seal the gates forever To prevent human evolution indefinitely is worse than any damage we might accidentally cause. So yes, I'll be your watcher. I'll remain unawakened while everyone else transforms. And if things go wrong, if the awakening damages something that can't be healed, I'll do whatever's necessary to fix it. Even if that means killing me? Damali asked. Killing everyone who's been awakened? Especially if it means that, Pierre replied with a cold clarity that made him seem ancient despite his youth. You're creating something that might not be human anymore. Something that might be beautiful and transcendent, or might be monstrous and destructive. Someone needs to be able to make that judgment without being part of the transformation, without bias toward what you're becoming. Damali felt relief wash through him. This was the partner he needed. Not a loyal subordinate who would follow orders blindly, but an intelligent observer who understood the stakes and would make hard decisions if necessary. The activation happens in 48 hours, he said, in Chartres, beneath the cathedral. You'll need to be present, but shielded. There's a chamber adjacent to the activation site where you can observe without being directly exposed to the pillar's emanations. What you see there will determine how you respond. Trust your judgment, Pierre, even if it means destroying everything we've built. The young man nodded. Then, surprising Damali, he asked, what was he like? Francesco, I mean, before they killed him. Conflicted, Damali replied after a moment. Brilliant. Brave enough to betray his entire belief system because he decided it was the right thing to do. He saved us 3 years by feeding us Vatican intelligence. Without him, we'd be going into this blind. And now he's dead because we couldn't protect him. Now he's dead because he chose truth over comfort, Damali corrected. The Vatican didn't kill him for being a spy. They killed him for being the one honest man in their entire hierarchy. That's the real crime Rome can't forgive, not betrayal, but integrity. The two men stood in silence, breathing air that had witnessed the transformation of 9 French knights into the most powerful organization in medieval Europe, knowing that in 48 hours that organization would cease to exist, would be reborn as something else, or would be destroyed completely. Either way, the old world was ending, and whatever came next would be written by whoever survived the transition. We should go, Damali finally said. Chartres is waiting, and we have an apocalypse to prepare. They left the empty vault together, master and watcher, the old soldier and the young guardian, both carrying the weight of a decision that would determine whether humanity evolved or remained imprisoned forever. Behind them, the empty chamber held only shadows and the faint scent of ozone, the smell of ancient power that had been stored there for decades, now dispersed, now waiting to be unleashed in a cathedral that stood atop secrets older than Christianity itself. The countdown had begun, and nothing would stop it now. The Cathedral of Chartres rose against the October sky like a prayer-made stone, its Gothic spires reaching toward heavens that were about to crack open. Beneath its foundations in chambers that predated the cathedral by millennia, the Templars prepared to commit the greatest act of heresy in human history, or the greatest act of liberation, depending on which side of the coming transformation you stood. Grand Master Jacques Damali knelt before the jed pillar in the underground chamber, his weathered hands pressed against stone that hummed with barely contained power. Around him, 43 knights stood in precise geometric formation positions calculated using mathematical principles that the Egyptians had understood and medieval Europe was only beginning to rediscover. Each knight held an object, scarabs pressed against foreheads, ankhs clutched over hearts, smaller artifacts positioned according to diagrams that looked more like engineering schematics than mystical rituals. The air itself felt wrong, thick, heavy with potential energy that made breathing difficult and thought sluggish. The chamber's walls, limestone older than the pyramids, seemed to ripple at the edges of vision, as if reality was already beginning to soften in anticipation of what was coming. In the adjacent observation chamber, separated by a wall of lead-lined stone, young Peer of Chartres watched through a narrow viewing slit. He wore no objects, touched no artifacts, remained deliberately unawakened while around him 43 men prepared to force themselves and potentially all of humanity into a transformation that evolution would have taken millennia to achieve naturally. The positioning is complete. Brother William called out, his voice strained. He had been awake for 48 hours straight, double-checking every calculation, every placement, every variable that might mean the difference between transcendence and catastrophe. We're as ready as we'll ever be. Damali stood slowly, his old knees protesting. He was 71 years old, ancient by medieval standards, and every one of those years pressed down on him like accusation. Too old to be gambling with human destiny. Too old to be making decisions that would echo across centuries. But also old enough to know that perfect preparation was a fantasy. That at some point you simply had to act and trust that your intentions were sufficient even if your methods were flawed. Brother Thomas, he said quietly, report on the external situation. Thomas of Acre, the scout who had been monitoring the roads leading to Chartres, delivered news that was simultaneously better and worse than expected. Philip's soldiers are 12 hours away, maybe 15 if they stop for nightfall. But they're moving with purpose. Someone told them where we are. The Vatican must have sent more detailed intelligence than we anticipated. Worse than hoped, but not surprising. Francesco had been tortured for 3 days. He would have told them everything, including backup locations, contingency plans, even the geometric significance of Chartres itself. The Vatican understood that this cathedral, positioned directly above a power vein, was the ideal location for forcing an early awakening. And the other commanderies? Damali asked. The scattered activations? Mixed results, Thomas replied grimly. Lion successfully triggered a local awakening using their artifact collection. Reports say 37 people within a mile radius underwent spontaneous transformation, genetic memories activating, consciousness expanding, some experiencing contact with the do-it. What London? He paused, struggling with words. London tried to activate without proper preparation. The objects overloaded. There was a fire. Most of the knights died. And those who survived, double quotes. What happened to the survivors? They're not human anymore. Not entirely. Witnesses report them speaking in ancient languages, claiming to remember lives from thousands of years ago, unable to distinguish between present and past. Their minds are trapped in genetic memory loops, experiencing every ancestor's consciousness simultaneously, without filters or boundaries. This was the nightmare scenario, the thing the Egyptian texts had warned about. Premature activation without proper stabilization could shatter consciousness instead of expanding it, could trap minds in eternal recurrence of inherited memory, could create beings who were technically alive but utterly mad. Is that what we're about to do to ourselves? Brother Philippe asked, voicing the fear that everyone felt. The Jed pillar will stabilize the activation, Damali said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words. London didn't have a pillar. They tried to force the awakening using just power objects, without a control mechanism. We're different. We're prepared. We're desperate, Pierre's voice called from the observation chamber. There's a difference. Damali turned to face the viewing slit where the boy's eyes watched with unnerving clarity. Do you think we shouldn't attempt this? I think you're going to attempt it regardless of what I think, Pierre replied. My opinion ceased to matter the moment Francesco was captured. You're committed now. All I can do is watch and hope that when this is over, there's still a version of humanity worth preserving. It was brutally honest and entirely accurate. They were past the point of choice, past the luxury of doubt. Philip's soldiers were coming. Rome's forces were mobilizing. In 12 hours this chamber would be discovered, its occupants arrested, its artifacts confiscated. The only question was whether the awakening happened before the soldiers arrived, or whether the Templars would be crushed before they could attempt their transformation. We begin, Damali announced. His voice carried across the chamber with finality that made the decision real, irreversible. The knights tightened their grips on their artifacts. Some closed their eyes. Others kept them open, staring at the Jed pillar as if it were both salvation and doom. Brother William began the activation sequence, not a prayer, though it sounded like one, but a series of precisely calculated phrases in Old Kingdom Egyptian that would resonate with the pillars, crystalline structure, and begin the process of thinning the barriers between worlds. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The crystal at the pillar's apex flared from faint blue to brilliant white. Light so intense it should have been blinding, but instead seemed to penetrate directly into consciousness without bothering with eyes. Every knight in the chamber gasped simultaneously, their bodies going rigid as the pillar's energy washed over them. Pierre watched from his shielded chamber as the transformation began. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't transcendent. It was violent, chaotic, and looked excruciatingly painful. Brother William collapsed first, his body convulsing as genetic memories flooded his consciousness. He screamed, but the sound that emerged was multilingual Latin, mixing with Egyptian, mixing with languages that had no name, all trying to express simultaneously the experience of remembering 3,000 years of lives in the span of seconds. Others followed. Some fell to the floor, bodies jerking as neurons rewired themselves to accommodate exponentially expanded awareness. Some remained standing, but their eyes went vacant, consciousness overloaded by the sudden connection to collective memory. One night, Brother Andre, the linguistic specialist, began speaking rapidly in a dozen languages, describing battles he'd never fought, loves he'd never experienced, deaths he'd never died. The air itself was changing. Pierre could see it even from his protected position, reality becoming permeable, barriers between states of existence dissolving like morning mist. Shadows moved independently of the bodies that cast them. The chamber's walls became translucent, showing not the limestone outside, but somewhere else, somewhere that pulsed with light that hurt to perceive and contained shapes that refused to resolve into anything recognizable. The Duat, the realm of the dead, the dimension where consciousness persisted after physical death. The gateway was opening. De Malay stood at the center of the chaos, hands still pressed against the Jed pillar, his old body anchoring the activation even as his consciousness expanded outward. Pierre watched the Grand Master's face transform, aging a century in moments, as genetic memories flooded through him, then becoming younger as those same memories rewrote cellular structure, optimizing, enhancing, repairing damage that decades had inflicted. Then Damali's eyes opened, and they were no longer entirely human. They glowed with that same blue-white light as the pillar's crystal, reflecting depths that no ordinary consciousness could contain. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made the stone floor vibrate. "It's working. The gates are opening, but..." He stopped, his expanded consciousness detecting something that ordinary senses couldn't perceive. Something wrong with the activation. Some aspect of the transformation that wasn't proceeding as the texts had described. "The barriers aren't just thinning," Damali said, his voice carrying both awe and horror. "They're tearing. The Jed pillar is supposed to create a controlled opening, a doorway that can be closed when needed. But something's interfering with the stabilization function. The gateway is ripping wider than it should, and I can't." He stopped again, his glowing eyes focusing on something invisible to ordinary sight. Something coming through the tear. Something that had been waiting in the Duat for exactly this moment, when the barriers would be weak enough to permit passage. Pierre saw it before the others did. A shape forming in the air above the Jed pillar. Not corporeal, not exactly, but substantial enough to cast shadows that moved wrong, that bent light in ways that violated physics. The shape resolved slowly into something that looked almost human tall, robed, with a head that might have been human, or might have been animal, or might have been something that predated the split between the two. An Egyptian priest, or something wearing the form of an Egyptian priest. Its face was hidden beneath a mask of hammered gold, not one of the masks the Templars had found, but something older, more ornate, covered in hieroglyphs that shifted and changed as Pierre watched. When the being spoke, its voice emerged not from its mouth, but from the air itself, reverberating through the chamber and the observation room simultaneously. "You have opened the gate prematurely, without proper authority, without the bloodline verification protocols that were established to prevent exactly this scenario." Damali struggled to respond, his consciousness still adapting to its expanded state. "We are the bloodline. We carry the genetic markers. We have the right. Rights are irrelevant," the being interrupted. "Consequences are what matter. You have torn the veil rather than parting it. Entities that should remain in the Duat are now free to cross into your world. Consciousness that should be carefully separated is now bleeding together without boundaries. You have not triggered an awakening. You have triggered a catastrophe." The priest being gestured, and suddenly Pierre could see what the thing meant. The 43 knights weren't just transforming, they were dissolving. Their individual consciousnesses were merging, bleeding into each other and into something larger, something collective that was forming in the space between worlds. But the merger wasn't clean or controlled. Identities were fragmenting, memories mixing chaotically, personalities shattering under the weight of too much awareness absorbed too quickly. And through the tear in reality, other shapes were beginning to emerge. Some looked human, some didn't. All of them had been dead for centuries or millennia, their consciousnesses preserved in the do-it, waiting for the barriers to weaken enough for them to return. Can it be stopped? Damale asked, his voice steady despite the horror of what he was witnessing. Can the gate be closed, the process reversed? Nothing can be reversed, the priest being replied. But it can be redirected, focused, given purpose instead of allowed to spiral into chaos. The golden mask turned toward Pierre's observation chamber. The unawakened one, the watcher. He was wise to remain separate. He will be needed to anchor what is about to happen. Pierre felt his blood turn to ice as that ancient attention focused on him. He had wanted to remain outside the transformation, to observe and judge without being changed himself. But apparently fate or whatever passed for fate in a world where Egyptian gods walked and the dead returned, had other plans. What do you need him to do? Damale asked. Not do, be. The priest being extended one arm toward the observation chamber, and the wall between rooms became transparent. Pierre could see through it as if it were glass, could see the chaos in the activation chamber, could see the tear in reality growing wider. Every awakening requires a center, a point of stability around which transformation can organize itself. Without that center, consciousness simply disperses, fragments, becomes noise rather than signal. Your pillar was supposed to provide that stability, but the premature activation damaged its functionality. You need a different anchor. A human anchor, Pierre said quietly, understanding what was being asked. A conscious anchor, the being corrected. Someone who can hold individual identity while surrounded by collective consciousness. Someone who can remember what it means to be singular while everyone else becomes plural. You were trained for this, prepared without knowing you were being prepared. The Templars were wiser than they understood when they isolated you from the artifacts. Damale's transformed eyes found Pierre through the transparent wall. I won't order you to do this. It's too much to ask. But if there's any chance of salvaging this, of transforming catastrophe into merely difficult transformation, how do I do it? Pierre interrupted. He didn't need convincing, didn't need to be persuaded. He could see what was happening to the Knights, could see consciousnesses dissolving like salt in water. If there was even a possibility of giving that dissolution structure, purpose, meaning, then the choice was already made. The priest being spoke quickly now, urgency entering its timeless voice. Step into the activation chamber. Stand at the base of the pillar. Do not touch any artifacts. Do not try to join the collective consciousness forming around you. Simply remain yourself. Hold on to your identity, your individuality, your boundaries, while everything around you tries to dissolve those same things. Be the eye in the center of the storm. Be the still point around which transformation can spiral without losing all coherence. Pierre moved toward the chamber door before rational thought could intercede. He had 40 seconds, maybe less, before complete chaos consumed everyone in the room. 40 seconds to become what the Egyptians had called a K-anchor, a human being who served as focal point for collective consciousness, who held space for multiplicity while remaining resolutely singular. The door opened. The activation chamber's air hit him like a physical force, thick with power and possibility and the scent of ozone mixed with something older, something that smelled like desert sand and ancient incense. Pierre forced himself to walk forward, to approach the Jed pillar, while around him knights writhed in transformation that was destroying them even as it elevated them. He reached the pillar's base, placed his back against the humming stone, and began the most difficult task a human being could attempt, remaining unchanged in the center of absolute change. The collective consciousness crashed against him like a wave, trying to absorb him, to make him part of the transformation. Pierre felt the pull, oh God. He felt it, the seductive promise of expanded awareness, of genetic memories unlocking, of consciousness connecting to something infinitely larger than himself. He resisted, not with force, but with simple, stubborn presence. I am Pierre. I am 17 years old. I was born in Chartres. I remember my mother's face. I remember learning to read. I remember choosing this role, this burden, this necessity. The chaos around him began to organize itself, slowly, painfully, like iron filings, orienting toward a magnet. The collective consciousness that had been fragmenting, dispersing into meaningless noise, started to form structure, patterns, purpose, and through the tear and reality the dead began to return. The first of the dead to cross through looked like a woman, though gender seemed negotiable in her current state. Her form flickered between ages, child, maiden, crone, as if she couldn't decide which version of herself to wear. When she spoke, her voice carried the accumulated weight of 3,000 years. The barrier is broken, not torn beyond repair, but permanently altered. Your world and the Do-It are no longer separate. They overlap now, intersect. The dead will walk among the living, and the living will see into death. You have made consciousness continuous. Pierre held his position at the pillar's base, his singular identity serving as anchor, while around him the 43 knights underwent transformations that were finally stabilizing. They were no longer fragmenting, no longer dissolving into chaos. Instead, they were becoming something new, still individual, but connected, still themselves, but part of something larger. Demale was the first to complete the transformation. He stood, his body somehow both older and younger than it had been minutes ago, his eyes still glowing with that unnatural blue-white light, but focused now, purposeful rather than overwhelmed. When he looked at Pierre, recognition and gratitude warred with something else, regret, perhaps for the burden that had been placed on someone so young. How many crossed over? Demale asked the flickering woman entity. 47 consciousnesses from the Do-It entered your world during the minutes when the tear was widest, she replied. Most are benign scholars, priests, keepers of knowledge who have been waiting for this moment. A few are... She paused, searching for appropriate words. Less stable. Entities who died violently, who carried trauma across the threshold of death, who might not distinguish between the time they lived in and the time they've returned to. Ghosts, Brother William said, his voice carrying new harmonics as he tested his transformed vocal cords. You're saying we've created a world where ghosts are real, permanent. Not occasional hauntings, but actual persistent presence of the dead. Not ghosts, the woman entity corrected. Consciousness without bodies. Awareness without flesh. We can interact with your world, can communicate with those who have the sensitivity to perceive us, but we cannot alter physical matter the way you can. We are, she smiled, an expression that shifted across her flickering faces, double quotes, ... advisors, witnesses, the accumulated wisdom of everyone who has died carrying genetic memories. We are history made accessible. Through the chamber's entrance, Pierre heard sounds that made his heart sink horses, shouting, the distinctive clank of armor. Philip's soldiers had arrived, 12 hours earlier than expected, which meant someone had pushed them to forced march. The Vatican must have conveyed the urgency, must have made clear that every moment's delay meant greater risk of the Templars completing whatever they were attempting. They were too late. The awakening had happened. The transformation was complete. But they didn't know that yet. "We need to evacuate," Brother Thomas said, his enhanced senses already calculating exit routes and probabilities. "There are tunnels beneath the cathedral that connect to—" "No," Damali interrupted. His transformed consciousness could perceive outcomes in ways that bordered on prophecy. "If we run, Rome wins the narrative. They declare us heretics, burn us in absentia, suppress any evidence that the awakening actually happened. Better to face them, show them what we've become. Make them acknowledge that transformation is real, that human consciousness has changed permanently." "They'll kill us," Brother Philippe pointed out. "They'll try," Damali agreed. "But we're not what we were an hour ago. We're not human anymore. Not entirely. Not only—" He looked at his hands, weathered, scarred, but now capable of perceiving energies that physical eyes couldn't detect. "We're the bridge between what humanity was and what it's becoming. And bridges don't burn easily." The sound of soldiers grew louder. Pierre remained against the pillar, still serving as anchor, though the need for his stabilizing presence was diminishing as the collective consciousness found its own equilibrium. Around him, the transformed knights prepared to face whatever came next, not with weapons, though they carried swords, but with the absolute certainty that came from expanded awareness. The chamber door burst open. 20 soldiers poured through, led by a captain whose face showed the kind of grim determination that came from having been told that what waited below was demonic, heretical, dangerous beyond measure. What he found instead were 43 men standing in geometric formation around a pillar that glowed with otherworldly light, their eyes reflecting that same glow, their postures conveying calm that should have been impossible for people facing arrest and execution. "Jacques de Maillet," the captain announced, his voice professionally steady despite the wrongness he could sense in the air. "Grand Master of the Knights Templar. By order of King Philip of France, and with the blessing of Pope Clement, you and your brothers are under arrest for heresy, sorcery, and crimes against God and Crown." "Crimes against ignorance," Damali corrected gently. "Against the systematic suppression of human potential. Against the imprisonment of consciousness in limited forms when evolution offers so much more." He gestured to the pillar, to his transformed brothers, to the shimmering air where entities from the duet flickered at the edges of perception. "We've opened gates that your masters wanted sealed forever. We've proven that death isn't an ending, that consciousness is immortal, That genetic memory connects every human to thousands of years of accumulated wisdom. You can arrest us, execute us, but you cannot undo what we've done. The awakening has begun. The captain stared, trying to process words that challenged everything his faith had taught him about the nature of existence. Then training reasserted itself. Theological questions could be sorted out by priests. His job was to arrest heretics, and heretics these men clearly were. Seize them, he ordered his soldiers. What happened next would be debated for centuries, documented in reports that the Vatican tried to suppress but couldn't entirely erase, witnessed by soldiers whose testimonies would vary wildly but agree on core. I'm POSSIBILITIES. The transformed Templars didn't fight, didn't resist arrest in any conventional sense. But when the soldiers tried to grab them, their hands passed through the knights as if through mist. Not completely, the Templars were still physical, still present, but somehow partially displaced into a reality adjacent to the one the soldiers occupied. We exist between states now, Demolay explained to the captain, whose face had gone pale. Between solid and energy, between individual and collective, between living and dead. You cannot arrest consciousness that refuses to remain entirely corporeal. He demonstrated by walking toward the captain, his body becoming translucent as he moved, then re-solidifying when he stopped. We'll come with you, allow you to stage your arrests, your trials, your executions, because the world needs to see what happens when you try to kill something that has transcended death. Rome wants to suppress the awakening? Let them try. Every attempt will simply prove that the transformation is real, irreversible, and spreading. The captain, to his credit, didn't retreat. And if we simply seal this chamber, leave you here to starve, then our bodies die and our consciousnesses persist in the do-it, where we can communicate with every human sensitive enough to perceive us. Demalay's smile carried no malice, only certainty. Rome cannot win this conflict through violence or suppression. The only question is whether they adapt to the new reality or exhaust themselves fighting change that cannot be prevented. Peer, still anchored against the pillar, watched this confrontation with the detached clarity of someone who remained fully human while surrounded by the posthuman. He could see what the soldiers couldn't, that the chamber was now crowded with entities from the do-it, consciousnesses without bodies watching the scene with interest and occasionally amusement. The barrier between worlds had become permeable permanently. The living and dead now shared the same space. Though only some could perceive both sides, this was what the Templars had accomplished. Not quite the transcendent awakening they'd planned, not the controlled evolution they'd hoped for, but something messier, more chaotic, and ultimately more democratic. The gates were open. Consciousness was continuous, and whether Rome accepted it or not, humanity had changed. The arrests proceeded as formalities. The soldiers shackled the Templars with chains that passed through their partially shifted bodies, led them up from the underground chamber into the cathedral above, where morning light streamed through stained glass windows that now seemed to hold additional figures, dead saints and priests, perhaps made visible by the thinned barriers. Peer followed last, finally released from his anchoring position. The jet pillar's glow had faded to a dull pulse. It had served its purpose, would never be used again because it was no longer needed. The transformation it had forced couldn't be reversed or repeated. Humanity had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. As they emerged into the cathedral proper, Pierre saw the effect spreading. People in the pews, worshippers who had come for morning mass, unaware of what was happening beneath their feet, were beginning to glow with faint light. Not the intense blue-white of the Templars, but a subtle luminescence that indicated genetic memories starting to activate spontaneously. The awakening was cascading, spreading from the 43 transformed knights to everyone within range, then spreading from them to everyone they contacted. Like a virus, but benevolent. Like a plague, but of consciousness rather than disease. Within weeks, all of Europe would be affected. Within months, the entire world. Rome had tried to prevent this, had spent centuries suppressing Egyptian knowledge, containing Heka artifacts, eliminating anyone who approached the truth too closely. And they had failed. The Templars' desperate gambit had succeeded, in exactly the way they'd feared it would, messily, chaotically. Impossibly to control or contain. King Philip's soldiers marched the transformed knights through Chartres streets toward the prisons, where they would await trial. Citizens watched with expressions that shifted between horror and wonder as they perceived the wrongness, the rightness of what the Templars had become. Pierre walked behind the procession. No longer quite the watcher he'd been designated to be, but not yet part of the transformation either. He remained in between, anchoring both states, serving as bridge between the fully human and the posthuman. In his pocket. He carried the last message Francesco had managed to send before death took him. Pierre had read it during the chaos of the activation, had memorized words that were both warning and blessing. You have opened what cannot be closed, made permanent what should have been temporary. In your desperation, you have gifted humanity with immortal consciousness and damned it to never again experience the simplicity of merely being alive. History will not know whether to call you saviors or monsters. Neither will you, but either. Pierre understood now what Francesco had meant. The Templars had won and lost simultaneously. They had achieved the awakening, had prevented Rome from sealing the gates forever, had ensured that human consciousness could evolve beyond its limited forms. But they had also created a world where death was no longer mysterious, where the past pressed constantly against the present, where every human alive would eventually have to confront the accumulated weight of every consciousness that had ever existed. A world where privacy of thought was becoming obsolete, where individual identity would blur into collective awareness, where the very concept of self would need to be redefined. The procession reached the prison. The transformed Templars entered their cells without resistance, knowing that imprisonment meant nothing to beings who could shift between corporeal and ethereal states. The trials would be public, the execution spectacular, and the futility of trying to kill immortal consciousness would become apparent to everyone watching. Rome would adapt eventually. Would have to. The Vatican's collection of Heka objects would be revealed, their centuries of suppression exposed. The Church's authority would survive, but transformed, no longer gatekeepers of salvation, but guides helping humanity navigate its expanded consciousness. Pierre looked up at the sky, where clouds moved in patterns that his enhanced perception could now read as symbols. as language, as meaning that had always been there, but previously invisible. The world had changed, was still changing, would never stop changing now that the transformation had begun. And somewhere in the depths beneath the cathedral, the Jed pillar continued its slow pulse, a heartbeat from a civilization that had died thousands of years ago, but whose legacy was now rewriting the future of human consciousness itself. The Templars had found treasures beneath Solomon's temple, but the greatest treasure wasn't gold or artifacts. It was knowledge, understanding, the terrible, beautiful truth that human consciousness was never meant to be limited, imprisoned, or controlled. That truth was now free, and nothing, not kings, not popes, not the accumulated power of every institution that feared change could imprison it again. The awakening had come, and the world would never be the same.